tous et à toutes. Merci d'être présents en grand nombre pour cette journée un petit peu particulière où nous allons parler de la question au programme d'agrégation sur les mouvements protestataires, les contestations politiques et les luttes sociales en Grande-Bretagne entre 1811 et 1914. Donc nous avons la chance d'avoir avec nous 4 collègues très pointus sur la question et un collègue qui se joindra à nous en ligne. Et sans perdre de temps, je laisse mon collègue présenter le monsieur que tout le monde attend et qui n'a pas besoin d'être présenté, le professeur Robert Poole.
Okay. Thank you, Robert, for being here with us. Robert Poole is a historian, currently a professor of history at the University of Central Lancashire, emeritus. His book, Peterloo, The English Uprising, published with Oxford University Press in 2019, is an account of the 1819 Peterloo massacre in Manchester, on which he has written numerous articles and edited collections. Robert Poole is a historical advisor to the Peterloo 2019 commemoration programme, run jointly by Manchester Heritage Histories and the People's History Museum. Robert has also given numerous public lectures and workshops, including the Manchester Histories Festivals and the 2018 BBC Civilizations Festivals. He's an active member of the Peterloo Memorial Campaign. He also edited a volume of the Manchester Region History Review entitled Contributing to Peterloo, and he contributed essays including, I quote, what don't we know about Peterloo? A tantalizing question. We're listening to you, Robert.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm not sure. I had my memory wiped after 2019 and all the bicentenary, so I'm not sure how much about Peterloo I don't know now.
No.
I'm not going to go in great detail over what happened at Peterloo itself, because there is also the essay in the volume. What I'd like to do here is to show you some pictures and to explain certain points which I think are important and where it seems to me the English radical movement differs from what was going on in France or from what was happening with later industrial protests. So that's my particular angle. So I'm just going to look briefly at the context where I think that radicalism and war were as important as class and industry. I'm going to look at the events of 1817, 2 years before Peterloo, because there was an earlier radical movement, and what happened then and the lessons that were learnt from then crucially influenced what happened in 1819. Then I'm going to look at the mass platform movement, the mass movement for the vote, which got underway in England and Scotland in 1819. Then briefly at the Peterloo massacre, and then finally, just to take a slightly longer view in perspective. So, to begin with, I think that war was as important, probably more important than the Industrial Revolution in the protests movement of the post-war years immediately, and I explain why in the essay in the volume. Here is John Bull, the famous English figure, and the traditional John Bull was extremely fat and prosperous. That was then a sign of prosperity, the well-fed farmer as opposed to the poor townsman or labourer. And here in 1797, here is an extreme, I mean these are both loyal, on the left is a loyalist print, here is an extremely healthy and ravenous John Bull, having the French for breakfast or for lunch or something. But by 1819, over the years, the satires of the war, the caricature of John Bull gets thinner and thinner until by 1819, John Bull is a skinny, starved, downtrodden Englishman who's lost all his rights and liberties. So that's an indication really of how the politics of the war were mainly loyalist during the war but became radical in the years after the war. Politically, Britain had its revolution already, called the Glorious Revolution of 1688-9. Glorious because it involved little or no bloodshed. The king ran away and abdicated, and a new regime was put peacefully in. So that was Britain's revolution. And when the French Revolution happened, British Whig politicians welcomed the French to join the civilized countries, which are going to have constitutions and stable rule from then on. They weren't sure what was going to happen next. But here is a print from the late 17th century showing William and Mary, the new monarchs who were brought in, being read the Bill of Rights and accepting the Bill of Rights before they actually took the coronation oath. So Britain was proud of having a constitutional monarchy. However, there was a radical interpretation of this, and you can see from this Britannia from probably the 1810s, it's been changed slightly so that William and Mary, their head is bowed below Britannia, and Britannia, the symbol now for the English people, becoming a kind of radical Marianne figure, is crowning the monarchs after they explicitly accepted the Bill of Rights. In this one, the people are in control. So what the radicals were hoping for partly was to repeat the Glorious Revolution, but whereas it had been the propertied classes and the landed classes which had taken power from the crown in the Glorious Revolution, this time it was the people who were going to take power from the corrupt propertied classes this time round. I quite like this from 1792, a loyalist cartoon showing the contrast between British liberty and French liberty. This was how it was supposed to be if you were a loyal Briton in 1792. British liberty, you can see, is based upon trade and commerce, and it's based on religion, morality, loyalty, independence, justice, protection, prosperity, and happiness. Yeah? Britannia does not need her lion to defend her because she has a shield, which is also not needed because Britannia trades peacefully. That's the kind of empire that Britannia has. French liberty, on the other hand, consists of atheism, perjury, rebellion, treason, anarchy, murder, are you listening? Equality, gets worse, madness, cruelty, injustice, treachery, President Macron.
Oh, that's mean.
I didn't say which way one would use the word. Accusations go in all directions. I rest my case. Ingratitude, idleness, famine, national ruin, okay, misery. That is French liberty. I ask you honestly, ladies and gentlemen, which is best? Loyalist propaganda. Okay, but the really interesting thing is that in 1792, Britannia has the cap of liberty. The cap of liberty, this Roman symbol of the freed slave, stood for British liberty and was on the British penny until 1792. But when it had become the symbol of the French Revolution, the pennies from 1793 dropped the cap of liberty, and Britain has the trident, which is very useful for spitting the heads of aristocrats on. So the symbolism turns around. So there's a lot of politics in there. After the war, William Cobbett, who was a kind of Nigel Farage of his day, a sort of conservative populist who disliked the conservative government in charge, William Cobbett went over to the side of the people and produced an incredibly cheap edition of his address to journeymen and labourers. It was quite inflammatory in the first place to write an address to journeymen and labourers. And William Cobbett told them, the cause of our present miseries is the enormous amount of taxes which the government compels us to pay for the army, its placemen, its pensioners, and for the payment of interest on the national debt. That starts to sound familiar in both countries, doesn't it? This intolerable weight has all proceeded from the want of a parliamentary reform. In other words, if the people had the vote and power, this would not have happened. And the taxes mainly on the middle classes, but very small taxes on things like salt and corn, in effect, and beer and so on, did actually add up to quite a lot of invisible taxes on working people who are already well below the poverty line. The remedy was that all the payers of direct taxes should have a vote and the members should be elected annually. There are reforming Whigs at this stage and there are radicals. There are few Whigs in the House of Commons, perhaps as most a dozen, who are in favour of a householder franchise, every adult male who owns a house and perhaps pays the local rates or taxes. They're called radicals in Parliament because relative to the other Whigs they are radical. But I prefer to call them reforming Whigs, such as Sir Francis Burdett MP, a patrician Whig. I prefer to reserve the term radicals for those outside Parliament who want a franchise not on the basis of property but on the basis of citizenship. One adult male, one vote. We would now say manhood, but they said universal suffrage. So the most that the Whigs would concede, a propertied franchise to the maximum extent, was the least that the radicals outside Parliament wanted, every adult male house owner. Samuel Bamford managed to persuade William Cobbett that it was not just direct taxpayers, but in fact all adult males who should have the vote, by making the very practical point at a big meeting in London that the militia rolls, the registers of those who were liable for voluntary service or for compulsory service in the militia to defend the country, that could be the electoral roll. Cobbett said, I was persuaded. Yes, we can use the militia rolls as the electoral roll. Manhood suffrage is indeed practical. And Cobbett was converted to the full radical cause. Well, in 1817, the result of this radical policy being decided between the extra-parliamentary radicals and the parliamentary ones was a mass petitioning campaign. There were 700 local petitions for parliamentary reform in a matter of a few months. They add up to between 750,000 and 1 million signatures. Nobody's ever counted them before. In fact, as a proportion of the population, there were probably as many signatures for parliamentary reform in 1817 as there were signatures on the first Chartist petition in 1839, although, of course, the Chartists eventually got far bigger numbers. They wanted equal distribution of votes throughout the community, so all the seats should not be down in the south of England. There should be parliamentary seats in the industrial Midlands and the north as well, where there were very few. And also there should be annual parliaments to keep the politicians honest. This is the only radical demand, which there's never been a great deal of demand for annual general elections, but all the rest have come to pass. And the petition that was circulated was really interesting. It petitions, the small print doesn't matter really, it's the petitions of the inhabitants of Write It In, but you can see underneath there are blank columns. Now we're familiar with petitions with blank columns. You just write your name and anything else you care to write. But previously petitions, you would have to state your address, your status, possibly your income, your occupation, and to show that you are a citizen. These will allow anybody at all to sign. These are democratic blank petitions. And there was maybe as many as 1 million of these signatures on these were sent in 1817. The radical newspaper in London, the Black Dwarf, complained that petitioning, merely asking Parliament nicely, was not a proper political tactic at all. And I gather that in France, petitioning, a polite demand to the legislature, is barely worth the name of politics. You start with a general strike here and you work upwards. But the right of petition, according to the Black Dwarf, is said was not enough. When our ancestors approached their monarchs with petitions, they had arms in their hands to support them. Was King John petitioned to sign Magna Carta? Was Charles petitioned to lay down his head on the execution block? Or was James petitioned to abdicate the throne? Nonsense! The right of petitioning with your ancestors meant the right of laying their grievances before the highest authority and enforcing attention to the wrongs. And if you ever go to visit the public gallery of the House of Commons, you wait in front of some large murals painted in the Victorian period, including this one, which shows the barons in 1215 assembled in force to ask King John nicely, that little figure up there, not too happy, if he will sign or rather seal Magna Carta to agree that the Crown will follow a rule of law. I mean, this does not look like somebody being peacefully petitioned. So in demanding that the monarch intervene to grant universal suffrage, I think this was probably what the radicals had in mind, forcing the king, forcing the hand of Parliament. There were constitutional precedents for this. Well, the response to the petitions is dramatised here. On the left, the king is very happy to receive loyal petitions, but the royal rear end is directed powerfully towards the radicals who are asking for more important things and not just bringing compliments. The petitions were refused, and the risings, or the attempted risings of 1817, were essentially a series of regional attempts to march on London, to march on Parliament, to do what the Black Dwarf said they should do, to force the monarch to agree to tell Parliament, to tell his ministers to introduce universal suffrage. The most famous one was the March of the Blanketeers from Manchester in March of 1817, but there were others from Huddersfield, Nottingham, Derby, the East Midlands, the Pentrid Risings, and so on. They all ended with large-scale arrests, and spies and agents provocateurs were very important in getting the information that allowed the government to intercept the radicals, and in fact with incriminating the radical reformers as well. The role of spies and agents provocateurs was very painful for the reformers, who were very easily infiltrated, and that meant that in 1819, when the next phase of the radical movement came around, they decided to have a completely open mass movement where all the meetings were open, all the meetings were public, anybody could attend, the resolutions were publicly agreed to by everybody, and there was to be no plotting, not the sort of thing which spies could easily infiltrate. So, there was a year in 1880 and a year of trade union strikes because the economy recovered. And you can't go on strike when there's mass unemployment, as there was in 1817 or 1819. But the cotton weavers and the spinners actually got very significant pay rises by going on mass strikes. And the measures they used to organise themselves, the community organisation and the marching around with flags and banners and music, which they also did, were then deployed in the 1819 campaign, which was was called by Henry Hunt, the radical orator, the mass platform campaign. And you can see from this that there was a big series of mass meetings nationally in 1819. It wasn't just Manchester and Peterloo. The meetings began in Manchester in January 1819 when Henry Hunt, the radical orator, came from London to Manchester to address a mass meeting, as he would do again in August at the St Peter's Fields meeting that became the occasion of the Peterloo massacre. And the St Peter's Fields meeting was certainly the biggest, most anticipated meeting. Manchester was a hotbed of radicalism, of factory workers and handloom weavers, but also of extremely reactionary ultra-Toryism. It was a real clash between extremes. But in between, there are meetings in the Manchester region, in Stockport, Oldham, Ashton-under-Lyne, further north in Blackburn, in the Midlands, in Birmingham, in London. The Smithfield meeting in July was a very important one, towards near the centre of London. Rochdale, Lee again in Lancashire, before Manchester. So this was a national movement, and the Manchester one was the biggest element in that. The campaign started from the position that the wave of petitions of 1817 had been illegally refused because the monarch had not simply said no, but had refused even to listen to them, and Parliament had refused to receive them, and therefore a mass movement was necessary this time to enforce the right of petitioning. So we're talking about a movement with radical tactics, but still a constitutionalist movement. And I think this is very different from the case in the French Revolution, where it's a case of overturning one form of government and then starting a completely new one with a constitution. Well, there's the Smithfield meeting, and interestingly, they had their own red, green and white tricolour for England, Scotland and Ireland. Wales had been united with England, so it didn't count as a separate country at this stage. And there is Henry Hunt and the London ultra-radicals with their banners, very similar to the ones at Peterloo. Well, and one of the things that the Smithfield meeting said was that after the 1st of January 1820, if we haven't had parliamentary reform, we will not consider that Parliament represents the people anymore. It's called the House of Commons. It's not the House of Commons. So from the 1st of January 1820, we will not be bound by any future enactments by our representatives unless we have voted for them, chosen them. So again, a radical constitutionalist stance. In the spring of 1819, the radical Manchester Observer, which reached perhaps a quarter of all adult males who read it in some form or another at this period, perhaps as many as a third in the Manchester region. There was a meeting in, this isn't the actual date of it, the meeting was June, but there was a meeting, I think, in Oldham and Ashton-under-Lyne, which addressed an important communication and appealed to the people of England from the north. So the centre of the radical movement had moved to Manchester. This would happen later with Chartism, when the National Charter Association moved itself from London to Manchester in 1840. But this was actually happening in 1819 as well. The north was taking the lead. The mass platform meeting included a meeting at Birmingham, which had no MP of its own, and where the meeting, by simple acclaim of the crowd, elected a baronet, a hereditary Sir called Sir Charles Wolseley, as the unofficial MP for Birmingham. Wolseley was later arrested for sedition, for allowing himself to be elected in this seditious way. Okay. So, the reason Manchester was important was that it was a regional capital for the cotton industry. And I had this map drawn for the Peterloo book, because I think it's very important to be able to see that in the hilly areas to the north, to the east, and down to the southeast east of Manchester, these are areas where handloom weaving took place. Manchester was a factory town, and all the larger towns in capital letters were also cotton factory towns, but they spun thread. They did not make cloth. The weaving, the making cloth, was done by hand, and the handloom weavers, certainly many of them lived in Manchester and Salford, but the most radical, active, educated ones were in those hilly regions around. And it was these regions mostly that sent the marches into Manchester for the Peterloo meeting. So it was in many ways, it was the first modern-style political meeting, with marches from the trade union campaign of 1818 coming from the outskirts into Manchester, as handloom weavers were well used to doing once a week, to bring in their cloth and take back thread again to Manchester. This was not a completely new activity going into Manchester, but for the high Tory authorities of Manchester, it seemed that they were under invasion. The people who were not citizens of Manchester were claiming to join a meeting of the citizens of Manchester. So, the meeting ended with what has been called the Peterloo massacre, because essentially the local authorities took it on their own initiative to send in their own volunteer cavalry, called the Manchester Yeomanry, an urban yeoman. Most yeomanry were country yeomanry, by the way. My grandfather in Dorset was a member of the Dorset Yeomanry and went to the First World War. We have a photograph of him on his horse. That's what the yeomanry was in the Dorset countryside and everywhere else. But in Manchester, the yeomanry were publicans, high Tories, one or two factory owners, shopkeepers, the most reactionary people, the typical electorate for Nigel Farage's parties these days, I think, taking their revenge on the radicals who had absolutely no business coming into Manchester or claiming that they represented anything at all. This strategy of free and open mobilisation was, for me, one of the most important features of the Manchester meeting. Not just their political demands, but the way they marched into Manchester. They had banners to show which places they came from, with political slogans. They put the banners around the platform with the caps of liberty. There was one of Britannia, you can see in the middle. The old Britannia holding the cap of liberty. The Britannia that used to stand for liberty, that the government has taken off the pennies and considers an enemy now. So it's still a radical constitutionalist movement. And you can see Mary Fildes of the Manchester Female Reformers on the platform there. They marched in festive form, wearing their best clothes with bands and flags, bands of music, flags and banners, imitating the village summer rush-bearing processions as the trade union marches. They were demonstrating that they were not a mob or a crowd, but they had all the features, the organisation, the solidarity, the communal values. They had all the features of political societies, of coherent communities. They deserved the vote, but they did not have it. They were dramatising, if you like, their case for community and their case for being communities and the case for having the vote. They challenged the authorities to expose the authorities' own lack of legitimacy by physically attacking them. The authorities, with enthusiasm, took up the challenge and essentially sent in the troops, I reckon, psychologically, to kind of demonstrate that they were indeed a mob, that they were worth attacking, that they were not citizens at all. This demonstrated their point. And some of the banners are really quite creative. In fact, left and right is the Middleton Peterloo banner on handloom silk from Samuel Bamford, the local radical. His village of Middleton was a silk weaving village, and they had a silk painted banner. This is the oldest political banner which survives, made for a demo with an inscription or slogan. We have military banners, we have trade union banners that are carried out again and again. This is the first demonstration slogan banner. The authorities claim that such a large gathering, and this is Samuel Bamford's, I'll leave you to read this if you like, it's in the book as well, but Samuel Bamford said the very form of the demonstration demonstrated that the reformers were legal and constitutional, and that they should therefore be free, be exempt from any kind of physical attack. Samuel Bamford had no idea what was coming. The magistrates, the Manchester magistrates who were there locally, claimed that this meeting was in effect already a riot, since what else could possibly happen but a riot if you got Henry Hunt to address a large crowd of excitable people. They sent in the volunteer cavalry, the yeomanry, to arrest Henry Hunt, but the cavalry, having arrested Henry Hunt, decided they would attack the flags and banners, because that's what real soldiers do. You go straight for the enemy flags and banners, you seize the colours, and the victory is theirs. They were playing at soldiers, essentially. They were playing with people's lives. 15 were killed on the field of Peterloo, and probably nearly 700 seriously injured. There is a video on Vimeo. If you search for Peterloo Vimeo, that's the best place to see it. You can probably get it on YouTube, which dramatises the events of the day and shows you exactly what happened in what order. Well, the authorities won the Battle of Peterloo, if you wish. The Six Act came in to prevent all kinds of political mobilisations. You couldn't march in what they saw as paramilitary order with flags and banners. You needed permission for these assemblies and so on. So the authorities clamped down with the Six Acts in 1820, but they lost the moral battle, not least because there had been female reformers present. The female reformers of Blackburn, a month before, came on the platform to present a cap of liberty to the male reformers on the platform, to urge them to stand fast to the cause of the reform in the name of their families, but they were ferociously satirised by George Cruikshank in this print of the female reformers of Blackburn. If you've seen the film of Peterloo, you'll see the entry of the female reformers of Manchester on St Peter's Field. It was an extremely dignified and well-organised thing, which got great applause from the crowd at the time. And that's what it was really like, as far as we know. Mary Fildes, the leader of the Manchester female reformers, sat on the front of Henry Hunt's carriage, waving her own banner with Britannia and the cap of liberty upon it, and then transferred to the platform and waved her banner from the platform. An extremely provocative thing for a woman to be doing in high Tory Manchester, perhaps comparable to some of the women's protests in Iran in the way they would deliberately challenge the authorities. And the Manchester female reformers were to send an address to Henry Hunt on the platform, which was essentially that their wives, their husbands, their fathers and their sons should never unfurl their flags except in the cause of female reform, and may a female's curse pursue the coward who deserts the standard. The women at Peterloo were particularly ferociously attacked, almost as if the soldiers with their sabres and the special constables with their truncheons deliberately went for the women. It was very difficult to argue that these women were illegitimate protesters, except by treating them in that way, to show that they deserve none of the dignity of women. And you can see from here, if you're doing a graphic novel, you can do an aerial view, and it doesn't cost any more, cast of thousands and the rest of it, than it does to do an ordinary double panel. But roughly speaking, that was what happened. The yeomanry attacked, the crowd panicked, and then they had to send in the regular hussars to clear the field. No wonder hundreds of people were crushed, but at least 200 were killed directly by sabres, were injured directly by sabre wounds, and women were at least twice as likely to be injured by sabres as were the men. That's the Vimeo link. After Peterloo, you can see on the right the famous image of the soldier attacking the defenceless woman with the child became the icon of Peterloo. Yeah? That was the symbol of what the authorities had turned to. So although Peterloo was a physical defeat for the radicals, and the legislation that came in afterwards stopped further such demonstrations for a while anyway, it was a moral victory. But the cartoonist, George Cruikshank, was the same in both cases. Cartoonists did not go, work for either left-wing or right-wing newspapers in these days. They were hired pens, and they were pointing them in whatever direction they were paid, which was usually the loyalist direction. But Cruikshank himself did both the ferocious caricatures of the female reformers and the women being attacked. Never again, after 1819, did Cruikshank do a similar picture. Finally then, democracy in Britain, the context. After Peterloo, the radical movement was in abeyance for more than a decade. But when in 1830 the radical movement revived, it was as a completely open mass platform movement of a very similar kind, the difference being that the middle classes and the working classes were united together. Although the Reform Act itself was a great disappointment to the working class reformers, and what happened then engendered Chartism, the very fact of it having been forced through by a mass movement demonstrated the success of the kind of tactics that were supposed to have worked in 1819. They would work if the middle class was with you, but not otherwise. At the crucial meeting in Birmingham, the biggest mass meeting, the equivalent of Peterloo with the Manchester meeting was a meeting in Birmingham, there were armed troops ready with their sabres freshly ground to attack the crowds, but the authorities did not dare send them in because they dared not risk another Peterloo. So it may be that one of the legacies of Peterloo was that the 1832 reform, disappointing as it was forced through by a mass platform movement. And there I'll leave. Thank you.